When you think about America in the 1920s, what comes to mind? Chances are it's stuff like flappers and jazz music. But the reality of who the American people actually were back then is, well, it's way more complex. It was a nation of incredible contrasts. And to really get a handle on the 20th century, we have to start by understanding the people.
You've probably heard this phrase before, right? The Great American Melting Pot. The whole idea was that people from all over the world could come here, mix together, and create this single, new American identity. It's a really powerful and optimistic idea. But the big question is, how true was it? So, to answer that, we really need to look at the different ingredients that were supposedly getting mixed together in this pot. Because the America of the 1920s was incredibly diverse, for sure, but it was anything but a simple blend.
Yeah. See, it wasn't one single story. It was more like four completely different stories all happening at the same time. You had the first Americans, the early immigrants, African Americans, and then the new immigrants. And each of these groups had a profoundly different experience of what it even meant to be an American. So let's dive in, starting from the very beginning.
We hear it all the time. America is a nation of immigrants. But that story doesn't just start with ships crossing the Atlantic. Nope. Long before any Europeans arrived, this continent was already home to millions of people.
We're talking about the first Americans, of course, also known as Native Americans. They had been living here in organized tribes for thousands of years. But when European settlers arrived, everything changed. They were systematically pushed off their ancestral lands and forced to live in these designated areas called reservations.
And the human cost of this expansion was just devastating. Look at this number. A population that might have been as high as 5 million was cut down to just 250,000 by the year 1900. I mean, that is a staggering, almost unimaginable decline, and it really shows you just how violent this period was.
All right, next up, we have the early immigrants. These were the white settlers, mostly from Northern and Western Europe, places like Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany. They started arriving way back in the 1600s. And after they fought and won a war of independence against Britain, this group basically set themselves up as the dominant force in this new country.
And this is where you really see the power dynamic at play. By the early 1900s, a certain part of this group, often called WASPs for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, had formed a powerful elite. Now get this, they were only about 10% of the population, but they controlled an unbelievable 90% of the country's wealth. This meant they had the best jobs, the most land, and pretty much all the political power.
The third major group, making up another 10% or so of the population, were African Americans. By 1920, there were about 10 million of them. The vast majority were the descendants of people who had been kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery. And even though slavery was abolished in 1865, the promise of freedom, well, it was very, very different from the reality.
The truth is, life for most African Americans in the 1920s was defined by discrimination that was built into the system. They were among the poorest people in the country and were systematically denied the most basic rights and opportunities, from voting and getting a good job to finding decent housing and getting a proper education.
And finally, you have the new ingredients in the melting pot. Starting around 1850, a huge wave of people began arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. We're talking Italy, Poland, Russia, as well as from places like China, Japan, and Latin America. Many were poor, couldn't read or write, and they packed into cities looking for any kind of work they could get. But instead of being welcomed, they were often met with a whole lot of suspicion by the more established groups. So you have all these different groups of people. But what were the rules of the game? Let's take a look at the system of government that was supposed to hold this really complex society together.
At the very foundation of it all is the Constitution. Right after the War for Independence, America's founders created this single document to be the ultimate rulebook, laying out exactly how the new country was supposed to work.
And a key feature of this rulebook is a two-tiered system. You've got the federal government in Washington, D.C., which handles the big picture stuff for the whole country, like foreign affairs and the military. But then each individual state has its own government, which makes laws just for that state on things like local police and courts. This division of power is absolutely fundamental to understanding America.
Within this system, two major political parties came to dominate. You had the Republican Party, which was generally conservative. They favored tradition, low taxes, and a hands-off approach to the economy called laissez-faire. This made them very popular with business owners, especially in the North. Then there was the Democratic Party. They were seen as more liberal, more willing to use the government to help out the poor and the elderly, and their support was strongest in the South.
So we've got this diverse population, and we've got a formal system of government and rights. But this is exactly where the ideal of America crashes head-on into its complicated reality. The promise of the nation was just not applied equally to everyone.
At the very heart of the American promise is the Bill of Rights. This is the part of the Constitution that's supposed to guarantee fundamental freedoms to all its citizens: freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of assembly, and the right to a fair trial. You know, the core ideals.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the catch. Even with those guarantees written down, individual states had the power to pretty much ignore them. And they did. By 1919, right on the eve of the Roaring Twenties, most women, almost all African Americans and Native Americans were still denied the basic right to vote in many parts of the country. The promise was not the reality.
And this brings us to the official motto of the United States. You can see it on its coins and on the Great Seal. E pluribus unum. It's Latin, and it means from the many, one. It's a beautiful expression of that whole melting pot ideal, this idea that a single, unified nation could be forged from many different peoples. And that leaves us with this central question. For the millions of people living in America in the 1920s, from the wealthy industrialist to the southern sharecropper to the brand new immigrant in a city slum, was this ideal of from the many, one, a genuine promise they could believe in, or was it just a myth?